Okay, hi everyone. Welcome back to my class, Political Science 377, The Modern Tribes of Israel. I'm very happy to have my friend and colleague for many years, Dr. Arnon Degani, here with us today, who'll deliver this talk, Peace Now or Never, 30 years to the Oslo Accords marking a 30-year anniversary. Last week, as part of our ongoing sessions learning about different groups, social and political, within Israeli society, we spoke about settlements and settlers, and that is building on cumulatively on many other groups that were introduced throughout the course. And I thought this would be a good moment to pause because this is probably, as an event, and Arnon obviously will walk you through the lecture soon, shows the dynamic between these different groups in a very pivotal, seminal political moment in the history of Israel. And I thought marking 30 years and now having a lot of perspective would be very good. First and foremost, I want to take the sponsorship of the MOLAD Center for Jewish Studies for hosting this event. And thank you for the folks who are home watching and connecting. I'll be moderating your questions when it's the time for the Q&A. After you'll be done with your question, the students in the class stick around and it will be time for you to ask questions. Due to confidentiality, we're going to open it up to the folks home first and then gonna have it over to you. I would quickly want to introduce Dr. Degani. Dr. Degani is a historian of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the Avraham Harman Research Center for Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he's currently working on his first book, which details the integration of the Arab citizens into Israeli society in the years 1948 to 1967. He's also a research fellow at the MOLAD Center, which is a think tank Jerusalem-based, and the author and host of the Oslo podcast. He also teaches an array of courses about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Middle East history, and Zionism. I'm thrilled to have Arnon with us today, and Arnon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm unmuted, right?
You're unmuted. You're good to go.
Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the staff and the head of the the Jewish Center for arranging this talk. And I'd like to thank Oded from the bottom of my heart for inviting me. I've had a great time in Toronto. We got a nice city here. It's truly an honor to give the Louis and Rachel Lesk Memorial Lecture in Israel Studies. And of course, thank you for coming, for being here, and for the people at home in the webinar watching us. It's really an honor to be here. So this talk is intended to give a sneak preview into the content and arguments of an 8-episode-long podcast called Hesket Oslo. Hesket in Hebrew means podcast, like it's in kind of hoity-toity Hebrew, right? In Hebrew, we say podcast. And it also sounds like Heskem, which is accords, agreement. Heskem, Hesket. So this perky pun, it kind of sets the tone for the entire podcast that's meant to appeal to a wide audience, Hebrew-speaking audience, who may not have picked a serious footnoted nonfiction book, maybe ever. And of course, the podcast is about the Oslo process, and it plays in front, it's in Hebrew. People who hear it, 95% of them are Israeli, and I would say 90% are Israeli Jews. Now, in Israel, the very word Oslo, it condenses into it a story of Palestinian deceit, left-wing naivete, terrorism on the streets of Israel, a deep polarization within Israeli society that led to Prime Minister Rabin's assassination. Rabin is the guy here on the left, on the right of Clinton. And above all, it kind of denotes a failure. Just by saying Oslo, as in Look what happened in Oslo. You'll instantly gain the upper hand when you're arguing with your left-wing nephew at the Seder table who thinks he's so smart because he's got a PhD in history. And trust me, I'm speaking from experience. The occupation of the territories and the Palestinians is cruel. The answer, Oslo. The occupation is corrupting Israeli society. Aval Oslo, but Oslo. The occupation will lead to a binational state and the end of Israel as we know it. Oslo. That is the automatic response. And more recently, right here. Oh, there we go. And more recently, this is from the last month. More recently, the idea that the right wing is creating an authoritative regime that would abrogate anything democratic about Israel. Even the answer to that is, where were you in Oslo when all these things were happening to the right? So the bottom line is that in the Israeli collective historical memory, the Oslo process, if you've lived through it, or even if you haven't lived through it, is the crown jewel of arguments against a settled two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. That's it. It's the number one thing you bring to an argument. And by the way, it kind of serves the same purpose in the Palestinian internal debate about what to do in the conflict. And we'll talk more about that later. So going into researching this podcast, I knew two things, and you can call these my own biases, and I'll own that. These biases they're based on my experiences of studying other chapters of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and kind of measuring those against the well-known narrative, the kind of national narrative that's around. And so two things I knew going into this, that the narrative that I will produce would probably have to be different from the one disseminated by official Israeli sources and official Palestinian sources. I knew that much. And two, I also expected that this narrative would be complex, nuanced, and not lend itself to any clear policy, right? What needs to be done. The best I could hope for is that to destabilize certain convictions that more open-minded Israelis might have. Essentially, I set out to move away from the national narratives surrounding Oslo, either the Israeli or the Zionist or the Palestinian, and apply the rigorous historiography to that time period, which has just now entered the kind of scope of the historical past. We're going to see more and more historians engaging in this time period. Now, since this alternative narrative stretches 8 40-minute long episodes, I can't really get into the details in this lecture. But what I will do is point out how certain anchors of the narratives stand up to close historical analysis. And I hope that this doesn't sound pretentious, but I'll show you some of the things a historian does in their workshop in order to get closer to the truth. And before I start pointing out the quirks of the established narratives of the Oslo process, let's set the stage with some facts we could all agree or should agree on about what happened in Oslo. So one, during this time period, Israel redeployed its military in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and in its stead, the Palestinian Authority, headed by Arafat, took over responsibilities of civil administration and some services and internal security, policing, but overall control remained in the hands of Israel. No one is arguing about that. Two, this time period saw an all-time high in the number and severity of terrorist attacks by non-PLO, non-Arafat affiliated organizations, and in some cases, even the Palestinian Authority's security services did take part in hostilities. A record number of Israelis were killed during those 7 years, 288. That record has been surpassed since, but at the time, this was quite shocking, quite it was bad. And of course, also many Palestinians died as well. We're talking in the hundreds. The numbers are less clear. Three, during this time period, no one is arguing that settlements were not evacuated. Not one settlement was evacuated. And rather, there were more constructions being made inside the settlements. And actually, during those 7 years, record numbers. Again, that record has been surpassed since. But up until then, during the Oslo period, there was a record growth in the settlements. And also in Eastern Jerusalem. And from the middle of the 1990s, we start seeing illegal outposts popping up, and those aren't evacuated, essentially making those new settlements during that were established during that time period, expanding the number and the total land area that Israeli settlers live in. 4, between 2000 and early 2001, Israel offered to grant to the Palestinians a state in successive offers that were, each one was better than the one before, and the Palestinians said no. 5, again, no one is arguing with the previous fact, and the one that I will mention now. The process is bookended by 2 intifadas, or Palestinian uprisings. The first one brought the 2 sides to the negotiating table. The second one set that negotiating table in flames. So the first thing I want to point out, after we've covered some of the kind of basic occurrences during that time period, the first flaw I want to point out to in the national narratives of the Oslo process are the 2 organizing theories of what caused the debacle. Why did Israel and the Palestinians not sign a peace accord? What is essentially the theory of the case? Now, these 2 theories, the Israeli one and the Palestinian one, existed in academia, and they seeped in kind of seamlessly into the national narratives, right? So we have a case here where serious scholars and the society which they identify with, if not actually come from, are on the same page. So one prominent proponent of the Israeli theory of the case, you see him right here on the right, is Ephraim Karsh. Karsh is a professor emeritus in the Bar Ilan University. He's esteemed and he's meticulous, and I personally enjoy his writing. And for him, basically, the reason for the failure can be summed up in 2 words: Yasser Arafat. We all know who Yasser Arafat is, right? Someone doesn't know? We all know. Great. The problem with Arafat was that he basically never gave up on the vision of destroying Israel. Karsh brings many examples of things Arafat did or did not do to prove that intention by Arafat. Like the clear fact that more Israelis were killed and maimed by Palestinian terrorist networks. He presents that as a way to prove Arafat's intentions. But he also points out the fact that he wore, for instance, a uniform to the Nobel Prize ceremony, which he was awarded together with Peres and Arabi. So the idea that, he didn't even take off his military fatigues in the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. That for him is an indication that he kind of stayed in that same guerrilla freedom fighter / terrorist mindset. So Arafat, according to Karsh, decided to basically to con the world and the Israelis. That's the theory of the case. Now, it's an interesting idea, but it crumbles under the scrutiny of a basic tool in the discipline of history I like to call logic. You see, it's pointless to argue the many facts, argue with the many facts that Karsh brings. Because at the end of the day, the argument Karsh is making has to do with the internal psyche of Arafat, which I would agree was not that of a stable genius at any point, but historians, they really don't have access to the thoughts of any person, much less an entire nation, for instance, if Arafat stands in for the Palestinians. People are complex, they change their minds, they lie to themselves, they don't necessarily have a great plan, they're trying to survive. And so if we were to believe that Arafat was plotting all along, to use Oslo as a way to facilitate the killing of more Jews, we would have to assume the following as well. That Arafat, who ever since the 1970s battled the more radical elements of the PLO to steer the Palestinian national movement towards pragmatism. The same Arafat who actually fought these elements in Lebanon to assert his prerogative as the leader to negotiate with the Americans. The same Arafat who pressured the entire Palestinian National Council to recognize Israel, who spoke of recognizing Israel in front of his people. That Arafat, all this time, secretly was trying to do the opposite. That's what we have to assume. Now, what we're saying here is that Arafat said things publicly, and then what? He passed a secret note to millions of Palestinians in the territories and the refugee camps saying, stand by, I don't really mean it, right? Would the Israeli or intelligence, the Israeli or American intelligence agencies not intercept this note from being passed when it was passed around? The fact is, conspiracies happen, but they can't happen on a large scale, a national scale. You can't pursue a national agenda while telling your nation you are pursuing the opposite one. Okay? So I'm not saying that Arafat does not have responsibility for the failure of the Oslo Accords. And I'm also not saying kind of the banal conclusion that both sides share the responsibility. Arafat may well carry a larger portion of blame on him. I wouldn't know how to quantify it, but maybe. What I am saying is that Arafat could not have followed a clear and thought out plot or ploy when he entered the Oslo process. He made mistakes. He sometimes chose to cater to a national sentiment rather than to the interests of the nation, but all leaders do that. And remember, at the end of the day, he was not out there to serve Zionism, right? Not looking out for Zionist interests. He was the leader of the Palestinian national movement. So in the podcast, I go into the details and explain what motivated Arafat. And what motivated Arafat to do some of the things he did, which Karsh sees these things as proof, as a way to, he sees those with absolute certainty that they point to a malicious mindset. I don't see that. Now, I also owe you a few words about the Palestinian national narrative. The Palestinian national narrative and the way it was propagated by propagandists and serious scholars like Professor there we go. So like Professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University, who's been this guy has been a true inspiration to me as a scholar. So if we look at Khalidi's the way he depicts or the Oslo period, he doesn't place the blame on any one Israeli leader and at the doorstep of any one Israeli leader or their bad intentions. For Khalidi, the culprit is ideology. What ideology? Zionism. Heard about it? According to Khalidi, Zionism does not allow its adherents to cede territory and forfeit sovereignty to the indigenous Palestinians. Like Karsh, he points to dry facts that no one would argue with that would attest to this inability of Zionists to split the land. And that Israel never had any intention of granting the Palestinians an independent state west of the Jordan. Now, on that second point of Israeli intentions, he has actual excellent evidence. A month before he was assassinated, you look at Rabin over there, and this is a photo from that talk he gave. He went on record in the Knesset saying that what the Palestinians will get in the end is less than a state. Quoting him, less than a state. Also he mentioned that the entire Jordan Valley, this area here, will stay under Israeli sovereignty or control. And of course, Jerusalem will remain Israeli and united. And another indication of Israeli Zionist commitment to never granting the Palestinians more than just a municipality status is ever expanding settlements, which could, at the very least, indicate a measure of intent to stay put, right? You'd have to agree with me on that, or no? And at the end of the day, this idea that Israelis only wanted to continue to control the Palestinians, but just not directly have some sort of middleman, That's essentially what happened. That's essentially the world we were living in since the 90s. And so, since this is the result, this is probably what it was always meant to be. That, I think, is sort of the logic there. Now, this is an interesting idea, but it crumbles under the scrutiny of a basic tool we in the discipline of history like to call logic. I'm bombing here. Yes, it is true that Rabin had no intention of granting the Palestinians full statehood. I'll take him at his word in his speech in 1995. But in Camp David, in the year 2000, it did end with an offer of a state to the Palestinians. And Arafat said no. Now, I can explain why, and in the Q&A, we can get into that. And I got some great explanations why he said no, but he could have said yes. I mean, like the laws of physics would say that he could have said yes. And Khalidi would have us believe, though, that the Prime Minister Barak, who was the Prime Minister at the time, banked on Arafat saying no. The theory of the case is that somehow Barak thought this would improve his political career or legacy, that to be remembered for being the sucker that gave Arafat the most and still got a no. I don't see it. Isn't logical. Now, Barak gave an offer. He gave an offer Arafat could refuse. But did he know for a fact that he would refuse, Barak? And nothing would indicate that he would. There's no proof of that. And here's another thing to consider. I'm an Israeli. I consider myself a Zionist. I believe in a fair deal that goes way beyond what Barak offered. Years after the Oslo Process collapsed, many Israelis believed in a two-state solution. Perfectly mainstream Zionist Israelis. Now, one can imagine that if they were in power under different circumstances, they would have done steps in that direction, right? So, like, I'm living proof of the ability of Zionism to affect within its adherents a willingness to split the land. There are many reasons why these Zionists are not in power, and I'm be happy to go over those, but those have nothing to do with a certain kind of inability and essence of Zionism to share sovereignty over the land. So we, or at least I, understand that Oslo's failure is not the result of either side's intentions to rob the other side from what they wanted the most. Israelis wanted security, and Palestinians wanted self-determination in the form of a state. And neither side is unable to accept these. Why did it fail is something I get into in the podcast. And if you know Hebrew, you can find it in all platforms. And in a couple of months, I'll start uploading chapters in the English version, which we've landed on a title called Still Processing. Again, pun. So, but for now, I'll leave you with a healthy doubt about the reigning common wisdom. I hope I've helped you. I've done that. You want to stop here for questions, or we have more time? Excellent. So I'll give one specific example of what time and events that happened after Oslo have done to the memory of Oslo. Kind of show you how I approached, certain particular events, not the grand picture, like the grand theory of the case as I did up until then. So once I finished the podcast, I received some feedback, critical of an omission I've made. I failed to mention what is known by those that kind of know their way around the Oslo history as the Johannesburg or the Hudaybiyah speech by Arafat. And this is frame from that speech. So if you Google search, either in Hebrew or in English, the words Hudaybiyah, Arafat, and Johannesburg, you will undoubtedly find in the first 10 results some sort of version of the following story I'm about to tell you. On May 10th, 1994, right after the signing of one of the many agreements during the Oslo period, Arafat attended in South Africa the inauguration of, guess who? Nelson Mandela, right. And during his time in Johannesburg, he goes to a mosque, a very central mosque of the Muslim community, and he's secretly recorded by an undercover journalist who shares the tape with the Israeli right-wing media outlet outset 7, Channel 7. Now, the content of that speech is explosive. And 2 points that Arafat makes in that speech. Arafat calls upon Muslims to join him on a jihad to Jerusalem. And 2, Arafat says that the agreement he signed is like the Hudaybiyah Treaty. Anyone know what the Hudaybiyah Treaty is? Well, a lot of Israelis know. It's a treaty signed by the Prophet Muhammad with his rivals at the time, the Quraysh tribe. And then 2 years later, he backtracks and renews attacks on that tribe until he finally defeats them. So it is a story of going back on an agreement, right? By the most important character of the Muslim faith other than the God himself. So at the time when this comes out, there's a lot of noise, a lot of concern in Israel. It makes the front page of all the newspapers. I had to go there. Rabin and Peres. Rabin is the person you saw. Peres is the foreign minister, minister of foreign affairs. They're very upset. Arafat had to make a lexical clarification about the word jihad, which means holy war, but also means effort, struggle. We need to join in concentrate our efforts to liberate Jerusalem. It's a way of saying that as well. And he had to reaffirm his commitment to abandon the armed struggle and just negotiate. Now, had the Oslo process succeeded, then this anecdote might have been forgotten. But since it failed, and how it failed in the kind of flames of the Second Intifada, and in the Israeli discourse, it failed because of Arafat's deceitfulness. The story of the speech, not the actual speech itself, but the story of this speech became proof, or another proof, of that big plot I told you before, to tell the Israelis and the world one thing, and to tell, I don't know, Muslims or Palestinians what the real intentions are. All we had to do, people who boosted the Oslo Accords in Israel, all those naive leftists, is just to listen to this speech. And we didn't want to listen to this speech. That's how the story goes. So what happened here, really? Did Arafat accidentally reveal his true intentions and he just couldn't imagine that his words would leave the room? Again, doesn't make sense. What I did is that instead of reading the countless accounts of what Arafat said and why, and all these kind of interpretations of the Quran and Muhammad's life, and I went to the actual text of the speech at the Israeli archives that they're online. The speech was spoken in English, very broken English, by the way, and it just exists there as an official file. And I found out that to conclude that idea, that this speech was meant to be heard only by South African Muslims, does not stand the scrutiny of a basic tool we in the discipline of history like to call logic. Seriously, it fails to take into account what really happens here. What really happened here is that the later depictions fail to take into account the Israeli public opinion of the time. Okay, the speech Arafat gave was a big deal in 1994, indeed. The idea that this process would end with Jerusalem, or even part of it, in the hands of the Palestinians, in 1994, it was unheard of. Nowadays, the few of us who think that a two-state solution is possible, and that's the way to move forward, we all know that Jerusalem will have to be shared, right, nowadays. But and no one's hiding it, right? But at the time, in 1994, saying that you are aiming for Jerusalem was heard by Israelis as, I do not want to sign a peace treaty in 1994. And how do I know this? Well, in 1996, 2 years after that speech, I'm campaigning for the Labour Party and Peres against Bibi and the Likud. That's me right here on the left, hanging a sign of Labour. And I remember distributing these bumper stickers on the right that say, they have this quote from the book of Jeremiah saying Jerusalem would reside safely, or something like that. And that was to counter the Likud, the right-wing campaign that Paris will divide Jerusalem, which I knew was a lie. This is a Bibi lie, right? Even after 1996, Barak, in his first offer to Arafat in Camp David, agreed to give a few neighborhoods on the outskirts of Jerusalem to Arafat. At the end of those negotiations, he was willing to grant him some sort of status and sovereignty over that area of the Temple Mount, which is really where, both religious and national sentiments kind of focus on. Only afterwards, Barak conceded to some aspects of sovereignty over the Temple Mount. So, the idea of sharing Jerusalem was something that even the most generous Israeli offers hardly addressed. So if in 2001, Israelis were almost unable to divide Jerusalem, imagine in 1994. And that is why, indeed, it's a feisty speech. I'm not saying it's kind of it's a very pleasant and warm kumbaya moment, but it's a feisty speech. Yet it's not very surprising or radical, and yet it still created a crisis in 1994. But in the year 2023, with the advantage of hindsight, I can tell you it's a very generic speech that reflects Arafat and the PLO's consistent demands all the time. There's nothing new. So what we have here is the memory of a speech weighing down on our historical perspective rather than the actual speech. Okay, some final thoughts. Working on this project, I was constantly amazed about the things that I remember differently or didn't remember at all from that time period. And I was rather politically active, as you can see. And I was aware. And it made me actually much more empathetic to Israelis and Palestinians, who ironically, they see Oslo as damaging their own interests. Both sides, they see it the same way. The narrative that I came up with when I wrote the podcast, it'll never catch on as the alternative to the national narrative, right? Partly because it's not clear cut. It's not that simple, right? But more than 14,000 downloads. I'm telling you, nothing that I've ever written or will write in academia will ever reach that kind of a crowd. And I hope that more scholars would get their hands dirty in this kind of format of podcasting. And I'm hoping generally that it will help. And, yeah, that's it.